Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for holding today's markup. Thank you also for your service, Mr. Chairman, and the same goes for you, Ranking Member Grijalva. Compliance with regulations aboard our fishing fleet is necessary both to protect our environment and ensure the safety of our fishermen. It's what sets us apart from other nations in the Pacific, where safety and environmental concerns are not as prevalent. Onboard observers perform a very important job in safeguarding our waters and our vessels. My bill, H.R. 5025, aims to ensure that ship captains and owners receive observer reports in a timely manner so that any potential violations can be addressed right away. Currently, captains and vessel owners can be charged years after the fact. This makes it harder to address violations right away and increases the chances of repeat violations in the interim. So this is an important issue that needs to be addressed, and I encourage my colleagues to vote in favor of my bill. Thank you.
Is there further discussion on the bill? Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Ms. Redewagen for bringing this legislation up. There is an issue, as you can imagine, coming in, as we've seen in many cases, years after a purported violation and trying to enforce it. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to take a guess that you can't tell me what you had for breakfast on Monday. And I'm not picking on you necessarily, just a little bit.
It's only because you know I don't eat breakfast, right?
But you can imagine trying to come in and enforce or raise an allegation from a fishing trip that happened years before. I think it's very difficult for our commercial fishers to be able to defend themselves. As much as this pains me, I'm actually going to somewhat agree with Mr. Grijalva as well, though, in that this legislation potentially does challenge the United States' ability to abide by our obligations under the Western and Central Pacific Fisheries Convention. And so I am concerned about that. And we were working on an amendment with Ms. Redewagen's office to try and see if we could strike that balance. We were unable to get all the way there, but we made a lot of headway. I just want to ask Ms. Redewagen, as this bill progresses, can we continue to work with you in your office to see if we can find that right balance to ensure that we're not preventing the United States from fulfilling its obligations under the convention while still providing reasonable time frame for your fishers to be able to have these allegations lodged, and we're not looking at these absurd years later type time frame. Is that appropriate, Ms. Redewagen? Can we continue working on this?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, absolutely.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Again, I want to commend you for bringing this legislation up. I think you're exactly right in that trying to bring up these allegations from years before is very difficult for these fishers to try and defend themselves from. But I do think that we need to strike the right balance in ensuring that we can fulfill our obligations under this convention. Yield back.
Thank you. Is there further discussion? Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank Ms. Redewagen for putting this bill in. The Observer Program has been in dire need of reform. I know, and talking to commercial fishermen in my district who have had significant issues with observers, the confrontational perspectives that they are faced with, and not being able to make trips because they can't comply with things that can't be complied with. I think Mr. Graves brings up a lot of great points. This is the tip of the iceberg as it relates to what we need to do to make these observer programs workable. And yes, we do want to make sure that catch limits are being followed and that we are properly putting in place these measures to manage our fisheries. But what we have are programs that are so far away from their original intention, and that is preserving the resource, and more about a back and forth of who is in power. This really does beg the question. So this brings up one of many issues with the Observer Program, and I want to thank Ms. Redewagen for doing that. And I hope that this Congress and this committee will take up these issues, because these things are extraordinarily important to make sure that these programs are workable. And I know Mr. Graves has fishermen in his district that go through this, as well as fishermen in my district, and hear about that many, many times from a large number of commercial fishermen that deal with this. And it becomes a situation where it almost forces them out of the fishery, and that's not what we want to happen with this. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.